Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. As you've just read, Lula wins our Brazil special. So if you're not familiar, there is a presidential candidate called Lula da Silva, and he's just won the elections, the runoff elections in Brazil as of late last night, I believe. So hello, everyone. Hello, Chris. How are you doing?
Hello, Rich. I'm very good. How are you?
Great. That's what we're going to be talking about. So, Chris, what's the first thing you want to mention about this? What's the first thing that comes to mind with Lula's victory over Bolsonaro?
So, I just want to sort of look at it from the angle of this sort of second resurgence of this pink tide. Obviously, it's quite an exciting time in Latin America, particularly Lula, who is a man that the Washington Times once called the best friends of tyrants worldwide, which is a description of a person that's bound to at least drive some interest towards a character. I don't know about yourself, but usually when the New York Times decides that somebody's a bad guy, that instantly draws me to them. So I just want to have a look a little bit deeper into this person. I know there's a lot to praise with Lula and his previous presidency. There's also a lot to criticize. He's not, just sort of emphasize on that. There's a reason why we call it the pink tide, and there's a reason why I myself call it a pink tide, and I feel like it is the correct answer. I'm not sure whether it actually is, but it's not quite red. It's watered down. If your red tide was your wave of Marxist Leninist states taking Southeast Asia one at a time through the 70s, this isn't that. It's a watered down. It's not quite, therefore pink. And I hope that is the correct answer. In my head, it is.
Yeah, no, some good points. I do think that's a good point to mention is the pink tide. Yeah, so other South American governments have seen the election or the reemergence of a left-wing, a leftist organization, some socialists, some not many communists, in fact. Yeah, so no communists, no communist parties. And I guess that's why you could say it's a red, not red tide, it's a pink tide. Actually, I wouldn't mind going through the list.
There have been communists in these parties who have got in. I believe Peru's party advertises itself on the core as a communist party to some degree, which I always found interesting that it actually uses a pencil as its logo, which I thought was as sort of differentiate as you can get.
Well, I think we should come back to the other parties later. Actually, what else is going on? Who else is in South America and what they've been picked up for, or what they've been elected for? But yeah, I think you made an interesting point though about the popularity. So I didn't hear about this comment of him being a friend of nefarious characters or dictators everywhere. Yeah, but there's a nice soundbite which I might play later. Apparently, he was one of the most popular leaders around the world. So if you polled someone or groups of people around the world, different countries, not Brazilians, not just Brazilians, obviously he was very popular in Brazil, but he was very popular around the world. There's a nice clip of Obama meeting with Lula on stage. He says, this is the most popular political leader in the world right now. And it's like when he taps him on the shoulder and sort of gives him a thumbs up or whatever. But I must say, the guy does have actually an extraordinary sort of path of how he got to where he is now. So he started in the 1980s as a trade unionist, representing the workers, set up the Workers' Party back when it was under the dictatorship, the right-wing dictatorship of Brazil, and then lost all these elections. He ran for the first time, I think, let me just check here. The first time he ran was 1989, he failed, ran again 94, failed, ran again 98, failed. And then in the 2002 races where he broke in and sort of then became president, served 2 terms, goes to jail, and then comes back and wins again. It's quite a journey. I mean, it's quite a journey to be, if you think about the tenacity of the leader, that's quite a tenacious leader.
It is. And I imagine it's quite a slap in the face to Bolsonaro, who has just been beaten by the man that he helped lock up.
Right. And also to have only 1 term. It's, from what I've read, unusual in Brazilian politics to only serve 1 term, similar to American politics in that sense then, the 2 terms being the standard. In fact, I think there's loads of things. As always, we've bitten off more than we can sort of maybe chew. So we have to try and cover a big piece of ground. Just some statistics. Obviously, there's 217 million people in Brazil, so it's a very big country. But as the results stand, De Silva, Lula, received 48.4% at the first round. So remember that this is the second round. This is the runoff. Yeah. So back at the start of October, Lula received 48.4% of the votes, and Bolsonaro, who's been described as a right-wing Trump of the tropics kind of character, with 43.23%. So to be honest, I'm not that surprised at the win. I mean, there was a lot of concern, and it did get close to the wire, but he had a 5% lead on him at the start of the month. All the polling said that he was going to be the winner, for a long time. If you look further back, the difference between the two was very wide back in January or February when they polled who would win the election. And that generally does tell you who's going to win, because as you get closer to elections, it doesn't matter where you are, generally the polling comes tighter. But it's that first instance which gives you the sort of more, I don't know, at least in my opinion, I think it's when you can see the stronger candidate. So I think the expression that I read was, it was Lula's race to lose. So in the sense that only he could kind of lose it, not in the sense that Bolsonaro could win it. It's more that Lula had to do something wrong in order to lose, rather than Bolsonaro win, if that makes sense. Yeah. So
I don't know. In terms of these two characters, it shows that their starting positions that they're already a million miles away from each other. You've got obviously Bolsonaro, who is a former military captain, and Lula, who is a trade union worker. I can't imagine any sort of situation where anybody who's really into politics would be that. There can't really be much of a middle camp between the two. These seems like Bolsonaro. Obviously, if we want to use an American sort of analogy, these are sort of MAGA Republicans that are appealed to him. He was that sort of right-wing populist. Some in the West called him fascist, which I always find very lazy sort of comparison. When it's easy to call any right-wing populist a fascist, but fascists tend to not lose elections very easily. That's what kind of makes them fascist.
Right. Yeah, actually, I think that's an important thing, is that whenever people talk about politics, they generally try and find their sort of point of reference to try and compare it, to sort of say, well, what's this similar to? And there's obviously this easy thing to say, Trump of the tropics, Bolsonaro is Trump, therefore Lula is the Democrats. And that doesn't really, it works maybe a little bit in some respects with how, Bolsonaro is a populist, appealing to evangelicals, appealing to gun rights, anti-abortion, really terrible line on COVID.
Anti-communist.
And communist, of course. And then, yes, ex-military and whatever. So you can draw some of those comparisons. So waiting for this man to drive away. But then also, I mean, from my perspective, I think I can see a lot of similarities with South Africa. So you have a country with a huge poor population, very unequal society, very racialized society. It's obviously a former colony. And then it's a part of BRICS, a developing nation in that sense, resource rich, and then dealing with lots of corruption. So actually, in that sense, you can see a lot of parallels with South Africa. But then, you can see parallels in some ways with this, and then parallels with something else. I mean, you could see with Venezuela being a South American nation, and of course being focusing on commodities, exporting commodities, being integral to their economy. So it's useful to use external and other examples to highlight similarities, but at the end of the day, also Brazil is its own thing as well. Yeah. So I think that's a good point to make on that one. I wanted to play a quick one from Vox, which they made a nice graphic showing how Lula and Bolsonaro campaigned and where their support is. So I'll just push it up quickly now, because it is quite interesting to see how Lula got so popular, basically. A very popular guy, one of the most popular presidents in the world, if you take a look at this.
Politics has changed, and the story of Lula's career is a good way to see exactly how. Lula's left-wing politics are rooted in his days as a factory worker and a union leader.
That's where he began his career as a politician.
During Brazil's military dictatorship, Lula led massive strikes and protests. By the 1980s, he had helped organize thousands of trade union supporters into a political party, the Workers' Party, or the PT.
99% of people are living...
Sorry, excuse this crap advert.
Lula's coalition drew mainly from Brazil's political left. It included the working class, low-income people, left-leaning Catholic voters, Afro-Brazilians, and indigenous people.
This is a pretty unique arrangement of forces. In my opinion, it's one of the things that allowed the Workers' Party to grow and become so strong.
In 1989, Lula ran as his party's candidate for president. He made it to the second round and lost by only 4 million votes. Then he lost again in 1994 and again in 1998. His base was growing, but not yet enough for him to win a presidential election. During much of this time, Brazil was experiencing an economic crisis.
We'll jump ahead slightly. So this talks about the early 2000s and the commodity drops and whatnot later. So I'm going to jump ahead here.
Jose Alencar as his running mate. By including them, Lula expanded his coalition, attracting the support of center-right voters, like business owners and bankers.
Lula is this guy that he can go to a board meeting.
So yeah, I think that sort of makes the point I wanted to get across, which is that even though he starts out as a union worker, he does appeal and grow his coalition. So yes, he has the working class. Yes, he has the general poor, but he does appeal to business in some respects, to the center in some respects. Which is interesting, which is obviously, I mean, now that we've done this, our sort of streams on labor, as well as obviously talking about, politics in general, when it comes to winning these types of elections, it seems that you have to appeal in some respect, at least to some element of the center, or at least enough of those swing voters. I mean, it seems that Lula did, at least. I mean, it is possible to win without that, but it does seem that very few candidates are able to. That Lula certainly was appealing to the standard working class vote in the beginning. He didn't have enough to win, and then obviously watered down, I guess, his policies, or at least make them more palatable to the center later on.
Yeah, one thing that I just want to point out there in that video, which I thought was a very interesting point, something that a point that I try and highlight to people as much as physically possible. They mentioned that he was appealing to the Christian left. Now, there seems to be a huge debate amongst the Western leftists of how socialists should approach religion and the religious, whether accusations of pandering, are you trying to make any sort of Marxism appeal to Christians, accusations that Jesus was a communist, Muhammad set up a welfare system. Is this historical revisionism just for the sake of winning over the religious? I would say yes, and that is a good thing. We've seen failures of Marxist-Leninist states in the past where they have attempted to eradicate religion, what I would accuse, too quickly. I'm always of the opinion that you don't attack religion, you make the conditions of the religious that good that they don't need the institutions anymore. The idea of liberation theology, which emerged in the 50s and 60s in Latin America, was allowed to flourish and was adopted by these groups. So when Bolsonaro was around in this election, claiming to be the protector of religion, it doesn't have the same effect that it would have done in Europe from the 50s onwards, when it was either us or the godless communists. Because if the left sort of embrace them as well and highlight these socialist philosophies in religion, that in my eyes, that is only a good thing. And it is something that these movements did well, that the rest should embrace.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, particularly in South America, the relationship between the left and the Christians, particularly or Catholics and whatnot, is a strong relationship. Yeah. And you do have lots of examples of that. You've got Morales, Evo Morales, giving the Pope the crucifix that was a hammer and sickle crucifix. But there's also loads of other examples. I mean, you have in Nicaragua lots of the priests.
Pope Francis himself was he was educated through this liberation theology. He was an early practitioner of it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's something that should be considered. Absolutely, the role the potential role that you can in galvanizing people to join a left-wing cause or a left-wing movement or whatever. It doesn't have to be such a hard and cast sort of thing that we have to sort of go straight for the atheist sort of deeply theoretical sort of enlightenment ideas and cast away all of the the ideas that are still being practiced by the majority of the working class.
It's a hard thing to attack. To attack someone's belief, they instantly recoil. And again, a tactics, right? Should you really if you're fighting imperialism, you're fighting big capital, you're fighting, or even a sort of comprador bourgeois, do you really need to start the war on unraveling feudalistic sort of religion at that time? Is that the right time for that discussion? When you bank and a church at the same time.
And when you've got poverty and stuff, I don't know. Should we really go straight for the theology? No, it's not the tactical decision, right? It's not a good idea. At least I don't think so. I think you agree with me, Chris. But I have this nice little comment which I'm going to play here, which is it is about it's showing Lula with Obama and the fact that he was the most popular politician on the planet. So let me just play that quickly. There we go.
What was the president's approval rating?
The most popular politician on earth.
There you go, most popular politician on earth. And as you saw there, the approval rating was 87%. It's at one point, and perhaps not even higher. Which obviously, as we now know, only the CPC, central government, has a higher approval rating. Thanks to Harvard. Harvard said that. Thank you, Harvard. But I did think it was a funny comment, an interesting comment, actually, that you'd hear Obama even say that. And I think that's an interesting sort of thing to talk about, is the relationship with the US and the relationship with China. Because, under his party, the Workers' Party, so him as well as then Dilma Rousseff later, they go on to join BRICS and be, the first letter, Brazil, Brazil, of the BRICS coalition. And I think that's an important part, is that the US, it didn't seem to me that the US has a clear strategy in terms of containing these guys, because they've been able to go and link up with China, with Russia, with India, and make BRICS, which is, a counterpoint to the IMF, to the World Bank, to the sort of Washington consensus. And that's good. That's a good thing.
And as we discussed in a previous episode on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it is very quickly becoming a arm of that in terms of helping to sort of rebalance the power of the world in the sort of multipolarism that we like to come back to. This Lula was very much one of these early sort of pioneers of this, in this sort of wave of that we've seen of that since the Cold War.
It's certainly interesting, and I think I'm going to play some stuff from so Noam Chomsky and Vijay Prashad were interviewed by Democracy Now! And talk before the result came out. So this was a few weeks ago when the runoff had started. But I mean, the point still stands as to their comments about this, and that's exactly what they did say. Obviously, Chomsky was quite his first go-to point that he made was that the environment, the climate. So the big thing here, of course, with climate change is you've got the Amazon, and under Bolsonaro, that was basically a policy of take what you want, farm it, burn it, mine it. We don't care. Under the, I don't want to be too simplistic. The argument was that it was for jobs. These people needed jobs, and there was money to be made to be had.
He did actually say some quite worrisome. I remember him actually saying, I believe I'm paraphrasing, but not by much, we don't owe the world anything regarding the Amazon. It is our natural resource to burn as we wish. And it's very very blindsided, even for the most sort of egregious sort of capitalists. Most world capitalist governments now like to have some sort of aesthetic of pretending to care. He just didn't care about the environment at all, and he was very much just showing that it was a fire sale open for any business that wants to come.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a couple other comments. The guy was quite. I mean, I agree that sort of thing, saying calling someone a fascist just willy-nilly is a bit lazy and not a good idea as well, because boy who cries wolf kind of stuff. But he did say some pretty terrible stuff, and he did have a very close relationship with the military. I mean, he was a former officer. He kept pictures of the dictatorship era leaders in his office at Congress. So he's a congressman. Yeah. He was an officer, military officer, became a congressman, and then ran for president and won. But he's also got some comments about the woman that even if I wanted to rape you, you're not my type. You're not fit enough. He said some really negative stuff about Afro-Brazilians, implying that he said they're not even good enough for procreating anymore. Which, I mean, it's not a very informed or like sort of progressive kind of guy, or inclusive at least. I
think like what we talked about in our Labour video, where we talked about how racism is so often used for political purposes. These people that he aimed his racism at, he knew it was a safe bet because these aren't the people who vote for him, and these aren't the people that benefit from his policies. As you noticed with a lot of he seems to be very much from a lighter skinned sort of group of Brazilians that he represents. I don't think they'd be classed as white. I don't think they'd class themselves as white, but not, as you say, Afro-Caribbeans or dark or Afro-Brazilians.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess they would. I assume he would come from the class of people that are Portuguese, the descendants of Portuguese settlers and whatnot from the colonial era. Right. I mean, also the other thing is that he also did present himself as the law and order candidate. So why did people vote for Bolsonaro? Why was Bolsonaro popular? So obviously, if Lula and the Workers' Party were so lovely and informed and inclusive, why did Bolsonaro get in? And a lot of it comes down to the corruption scandal. So I think we'll talk about that probably in a bit, but I just want to talk about sort of what Bolsonaro stood for. So with the corruption scandal, the car wash scandal, that's where the unpopular sort of element towards the Workers' Party came. And then also you had Lula was actually locked up. He went into jail, which kind of knocked him out of leadership for a number of years. And Bolsonaro then used this moment to then sort of come up with his own brand of right-wing populism. But a big thing was, of course, law and order. He's seen as the law and order candidate. So, crime. There's a big problem with crime in Brazil. And he was seen as saying, so like, we're going to go in, we're going to shoot the criminals, and it's going to be law and order, sort of that kind of narrative, which you do get in America. You get in a lot of countries.
I think that was the sort of crime levels that you see, it's almost a meme in itself, isn't it? Like everybody, whether you watch film or play games such as Max Payne, Call of Duty, these sort of crime-ridden sort of favelas where you can go and horrible things can happen to you, areas run by gangs. It's a known thing. Or a known meme, at least, whether it has the basis in reality. It doesn't matter because it's just in the public consciousness how bad the situation is.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is, okay, I mean, obviously we it's only been a few hours since the results have been out. I mean, less than a day. So there is still the threat. I mean, we can't write off this idea of a coup happening.
No.
There was a general that was very supportive of Bolsonaro that had said, if law and order is being threatened and chaos is something that might happen in this country, the army has to step in. That's their right. It's their duty. So you do have comments like that occurred, that have been said. And I don't think it's, Bolsonaro did also mention that the voting machines, because they're digital, they can be hacked. They're not reliable. So a lot of stuff that you can say sounds like
getting their voting machines from Hugo Chavez, have they?
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, at least it's closer this time. At least they're next door this time. Yeah, but there is that still could happen. I mean, we're sitting here less than 24 hours from the result. Who knows that within the next 6 or 7 days something happens. I mean, it was a January 6th happened long after the results in America. So if we want to use that same thing that he's Trump and this is like America, this is divided nation that's not going to accept the result, that could still happen. That's still a realistic possibility. And Chomsky said the same thing, as well as Vijay Prashad. They both said that that's still possible.
Well, it happened in Bolivia, the country next door.
Pardon?
Like what happened in Bolivia, the country next door,
right?
Where the military.
Right, exactly.
Yes. Like, I just want to jump back. So when originally this tide that we're talking about, the pink tide, that was followed by what classed as a blue tide. This wave of reaction, conservative, that one, and that happened in response to the tide. It seems to have been the second pink tide that sort of undone that. But this blue tide was very much American-backed, military-backed. It was an attempt to stop the leftist governments come into power. So it's well within the realms of possibility for something like this happening internally with Bolsonaro in his group and the military. I wouldn't be surprised if the Americans went on the phone to any allies they've got in Brazil, working out what their strategy is, if anything. They will definitely be weighing up their risk.
Yeah. Well, there's also the other element of, you have coup, the classic coup with the military or the West being involved. But there's also this thing called, which Vijay Prashad called lawfare. So warfare, but lawfare. And this is also quite concerning because if you consider that Lula was locked up and then that conviction was overturned by the Constitutional Court, you can see how law can be used to, influence the politics and put someone in jail and put whoever, maybe overturn the result or something. So even though Lula has won the presidential, there's still the congressional and the Senate, and he still has to make deals. He hasn't got, as far as I understand, he doesn't have the legislature quite yet. They could also just use legal and legislature mechanisms, impeachment perhaps, to overturn the result or something like that. So that chance still exists as well.
Yeah. I say, even though he's won this election, and by the official results, by a fairly narrow margin, by the seams of it, this could have been a much bigger margin that the win. There seems to be a lot of reports of in areas police stopping voters in working class areas. We've got something here from the New York Times of actually up to 500 buses from working class and rural areas being stopped to arrive at polling booths. I've just got here as well. I'm going to pull up.
Let me just share that for you. Yeah, sure. So yes, Brazil elections officials demand answers for police stops of buses carrying voters. Okay, there were dozens of reports on social media on Sunday that federal highway agents were stopping vehicles and questioning people in several states across Brazil. Yeah, so this is quite a it's a clearly dirty tactic to influence the numbers, just stopping the buses. I also heard that people had said that this the chief of the federal highway agency, there'd been calls from Lula to actually investigate him or something like that because of this. I don't know if that's true yet, but at least it's true that they were stopping people on the highway. And of course, these would most likely be Lula voters. And because of Bolsonaro's stance on law and order and being very pro-police, I guess the agents would have been, or the police force at least would be in his favor. So this would be the influence that would be in favor of
and Lula. I think they've probably gathered from the regions as well that these are happening in poor areas. The voters are statistically more likely to be voting for Lula.
Yeah. There we go. I think you mentioned something earlier. I just want to bring up. Oh yes, I just want to go back to the pink tide again. So in 2007-ish, when sort of we had the pink tide 1.0, you had a certain spread of countries. So, you had obviously Venezuela, you had Bolivia, Nicaragua. But this time, if you want to call it, pink tide 2.0, in fact, it's actually gone further. It's gone way further than before. So before, obviously, you did have Lula back then. You had Brazil back then. But now you've got Brazil, you've got Colombia, you've got Peru, you've got, of course, Venezuela still, you've got Bolivia still, Argentina as well. Yeah, Mexico, Chile. So the only countries that actually haven't been taken by the blue tide this time, pink tide this time, is Paraguay, Uruguay, and Ecuador, and then even the sort of tiny republics
El
of
Salvador, Honduras, I think, are still not.
Yes, no, so it's certainly gone way further. Yeah, it's gone way further this time. This time is it's broken far more ground. And now that you've got Brazil, which is the most important, biggest economy of South America, in the pocket of the in the tide, this is pretty good.
It is. But these are really the type of results that keep Hillary Clinton up at night. This is exactly what we want to see. You know that the American State Department will be watching this very closely and panicking. They call it their backyard, and this isn't what they want to see.
That's exactly it, right? That's exactly it.
Socialism of the 21st century, as the coin has been termed. One of the main aspects of it, regardless of ignoring the socialism bit, is in their minds anti-Americanism. The refusal to toe the line of American foreign policy. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the big word here, Monroe Doctrine, right? So it's the 200th anniversary nearly of the Monroe Doctrine. And if you're not sure what that is, the Monroe Doctrine is the American doctrine that says everything west in our hemisphere, in the North America and South America, that's our backyard. Those are our interests, and no other power, whether it's Britain or France, or later, of course, with Russia, etc. No one else is going to have say or sway over here. And this is a huge sort of, these are countries now led by people that are happy to and are engaging with China, Russia, and other nations, as we've seen with BRICS and with the Belt and Road Initiative. Certainly a big slap in the face of the Monroe Doctrine.
And just to add to that, Iran as well, which is something that I wasn't really aware that there was a big connection, but Lula and Iran were very linked back in the day, to the point that I believe that America actually requested, when they wanted to set up what was basically the basis for the G20 deal with Iran, of supplying them with fuel for uranium. They used Lula as sort of a proxy to go through, sort of knowing that he had this line of communication.
Interesting. I didn't know that. That's interesting. That's very interesting. Okay. So he's sort of a precursor then. So he made that deal possible, the nuclear deal.
Yeah, I think it was the sort of precursor for that deal. Idea of getting Iran to talk about the idea of, we'll provide you with fuel for a civilian nuclear reactor.
Yes.
In exchange for you providing us with the enriched stuff that you're not meant to be having.
Yeah. Interesting. I didn't know that. That is interesting. Yes. Well, I mean, in terms of, coming back to the actual sort of Brazil itself, I think there's an important point. Of course, we've mentioned sort of where Lula came from, his first few years in power, how he built his coalitions, how he got the support of business as well as workers, as well as left-wing Christians. But the actual sort of political expediency, or what do you want to call it, sort of in terms of how to make deals in Congress, is an interesting discussion. And that obviously then leads into how they got into trouble and how he went to jail. And it's also about this all about this car wash thing. So I think we should go into that, because it was seen as it started out as the biggest corruption investigation or scandal in Brazil. And in fact, now is called the biggest investigation / scandal in the world. because it actually went way beyond just Brazil. And by the end of it, there's a booming, sort of banging statistic here, that by the end of the investigation, you had something like, let me just get the statistic up here, a number of sort of leaders from other countries. So it wasn't just Lula that got locked up. And bear in mind, he actually got, they waived that later. We'll come back to that. But you had presidents from other countries who went to jail because of this scandal. So it involved more than one government. It involved so many countries and so many companies. It was huge. It was huge. So just to give you some background, it's Operation Car Wash is what people talk about when they usually talk about this. And that name comes from the fact that it started out as a very little investigation into sort of standard money laundering. And there was a car wash being used, and the police realized, okay, this is a money laundering operation. They're using this car wash to launder drug money or whatever, some sort of normal organized crime, but on a small scale. They then found out, actually, no, it wasn't gangsters. It was guys working for Petrobras, so the state-owned oil company, the Brazilian oil company. And Brazil has lots of oil. So it became, that's where it came from. That's the name came from. And then it obviously grew from there when they realized that, hold on a second, the state oil company is using a car wash to money launder. So how far does this go? And that's where it started. But it's actually a fascinating story. And the Guardian does a really good, huge article on it. I can't read the whole thing. It's a good, solid read. But it's very, very interesting because it shows you lots of elements to corruption and deal making. I don't know if you want to comment on this, Chris, before I get into it or not.
Yeah, well, I'm just sort of thinking about how far reaching this sort of went, because I remember this was not the Panama Papers, the one before that, Paradise Papers, I think. Also, this went as far as like Singapore, Brazil, Peru, Mexico. So a lot of people were sort of involved in this, and I looked at it brought down by this as well.
Yes, yeah, loads of people were brought down by this. I think I'll find the who's brought down by this in the article. Let me just share the actual article, and we can sort of comment as we go through it, because this was the scandal which defined and broke not just Lula but Brazil. This and still to this day. So when people actually voted now, they voted for Lula because they do love Lula. Even when he was in jail, he actually still polled ahead of in the previous election when Bolsonaro and I forgot the gentleman's name, Haddad or something like that, the Workers' Party candidate that they put forward in the previous election. They polled who is more popular between those two, but they also put Lula's name down, and Lula was still more popular than both of them, even though he was in jail. So that just shows you the kind of support that he gets. But yeah, this scandal, though, destroyed and still has affected the Workers' Party. So it's actually a little bit questionable as to how much sort of survivability, because once Lula retires, let's assume he does this one term, whether the Workers' Party can break through that, that legacy of the corruption which came from this car wash thing.
Well,
so let me just open the car wash.
Predecessor was actually brought down as well, wasn't she?
Yes.
Dilma
Rousseff, yeah.
Yes. She was also impeached. I think it's always important we know how corrupt politicians can be in really all states. So I think it's always interesting to look at not only who was doing this, but also who was exposing it. I think it says a lot who it was who actually pulled this information up and what was their motives in doing so. Because I can't imagine it was just to shine a light of honesty on politicians when these are the same people that then allowed Bolsonaro to take over, who himself has been indicted for corruption, and so is his office.
Yeah. Well, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but there's an interesting thing about the car wash investigation has now been okay. Let me make that comment at the end. I don't want to talk about the end of it. So yeah, I'll come back to that point though. It's a very important point about the investigation and how far it will go or has gone, or and who, some limitations on it now. But yeah, so as this thing says, as I've already explained, car wash named because it was money laundering. It seemed like a small thing, and then they found that it was this individual here, Nestor Severo, who started the turning point of the car wash corruption. So the actual cop was quite interesting. He's actually a Japanese guy, or a guy with a Japanese name at least. Ishii is the name of the cop that started this, and he was famous. Newton Ishii. Yeah. And anyway, so yes, they arrested him, and then they started realizing that this is a lot bigger. And it sort of led to a lot of changes in the way they investigated corruption. So plea bargaining was introduced. That meant that instead of so that someone who's caught could bargain for less years or less of a fine or whatever if they gave up more information. And this meant that now they could go further and further up the chain of the corruption and see who was involved. And eventually what they found was that it was to the highest level. You had people in all parties involved in some way. And if you're not sure, like, how does state corruption sort of work, this is a good example. So I'll give you sort of, an example from this. And this is how it happens in South Africa too. So generally with corruption, you will have a contract, a government contract. So something needs to be done. It could be a bridge, it could be anything, the construction of something or the providing of some service. So you will file a cost for that, let's say 100 million of whatever currency. And it appears that that's a fully costed, project. Meanwhile, actually, the real cost of the project is like 75 million. And the 25 remaining then is just put into and billed as services, consultation, consultancy. So there's 1,000 different ways that they usually structure it or price it or whatever. But that's how it's done. And then that 25 million, which isn't actually necessary, it's just made up stuff, that then is then siphoned off either directly into a company which provides those services or products, which is owned by the person or usually a family member or friend, or it goes into a Swiss bank account or something like that. And that's what they did here. They had a certain percentage on these big projects, whether it was an oil refinery, whether it was a pipe, or it doesn't matter. There was loads of projects where they just found ways to siphon off the money. And that's how it worked, and that's how it worked here. So anyway, but they found that it was almost the entire Workers' Party. And because Petrobras, the state-owned company, was so big, there was just millions and millions of millions of dollars being handed around and being siphoned off. And it consumed basically the whole party, as you said, Dilma Rousseff and Lula in the end. But the thing with Lula is that it was found that he hadn't actually benefited himself. And they overturned the result because the way he had, what was it, something with implication. So he had been implicated, but in fact, actually, he had not benefited. And the way that the prosecution had crafted their case was political. It was intended to try and bring him down, and the Constitution overturned it. So, I don't know if you know more about that, Chris.
I was go into that. So when you say the prosecution, it wasn't just the lawyers. This was actually the judge as well. So the judge himself was a man called Sergio Marori. The Intercept did an expose where they showed that his decisions were partial and political, that he was passing down advice, investigation leads for the reasoning to prevent the Workers' Party from winning the 2018 election. And this guy was actually nominated, given the position by Bolsonaro, nominated to be Minister of Justice for Public Security when Bolsonaro won. So the judge himself was an opponent and part of the opposing political party. So it seems like a crime was committed, but then the investigators themselves were also committing their own crime, effectively.
Yeah. So it's interesting, but so the thing that the Guardian article also mentioned, though, is that in order to get the extra support from different sections of the population, as well as also just within political systems, so you have the Congress and the Senate, whatever, in order to get people to sign up to a deal or to vote in favor of something in Congress or whatever, this is where, Lula, as well as the party, had to then make those deals and what's the word? Sort of got themselves involved in this corruption. Obviously, there was enrichment too, personal enrichment, but a large part of it, or a big part of it at least, was this thing about, okay, well, in order for you, so someone would say, in order for me to get, to vote for you on this bill or whatever, they would give this person a seat or a job, or their company would get a contract, something like this. So that's a part of the corruption, which I think people perhaps need to consider, is that if you don't, or if they didn't make those deals, then they wouldn't have passed certain bills, which means their government would have failed. So it comes down to
trying to be a progressive in a deeply corrupt system. It's sort of,
yes, exactly. So I mean, obviously, I don't want to defend corruption, and obviously, the ideal system, is to get rid of it and stamp it out, because later on, it eventually becomes a huge problem. It eventually undermines your work anyway. Even if you get people to vote the bills mean nothing because the implementation is not there. It's all, people are just there for money. So later it can rot the system. But you can kind of see a little bit of the rationale is that, well, okay, if we don't give these people who are our opponents or who are only here because of expediency anyway, if we don't give them something, we won't pass this legislation. We'll lose. And then when the election comes, people will say, well, what have you guys done? And we'll say, we've done nothing. Because we can't pass it, because we haven't given these corrupt people what they want. So it's a very interesting example of that sort of fact in politics. At least some kind
in sort of a bourgeois political system,
right?
You have to sit down with these sort of opponents and make a deal. And if you make a deal with thieves, the chances are what they want is stolen in the first place.
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously, the article does say that some of that, some of those things that they wanted to pass were built on sort of ethical quicksand. So, the people that they bought off, who then did vote sort of momentarily, later, gave up or turned because they needed more money or they wanted more. So I don't think I don't want to sit here and say like, oh yeah, well, this corruption is fine because that's how you get stuff done. It shows that the complex nature of why this seemingly good party that wanted to do good things got themselves into such a mess. Part of it, obviously, is because of just personal enrichment and greed. Part of it is an attempt to try and make progress.
This is something that we've had to highlight for issues that we've seen, similar issues that we've had to see in other progressive parties that have gone through the parliamentary or the democratic route to socialism, as they coin it, like Venezuela, like Bolivia, and the difficulties and roadblocks that we've seen thrown up with them. And again, we're not saying the words, but so it's say, well, you wouldn't be having these problems if you listened to us.
Right. Exactly,
it just highlights that these are the obstacles that these parties go through, because the opponents will throw these things up. So it's difficult to get.
No, it shows you. Yeah, when you even if you win in a bourgeois parliamentary system, these are some of the challenges and things. It's not just as simple as win the election. Okay, well, you have to, unless you win everything. But also, that's the other part, is that with the campaigning, the other side is, which we mentioned before, is that the power of money. So even if you have great ideals and ideas, you need money to win, to campaign, and also it's not just buying books and films and speeches and whatever. It's also just like, there's a local candidate who he knows all of the local stuff like the back of his hand. He's their guy. They love him. He wants a kickback. That's what he'll do. You'll get his voters with that. So it's there's money on that side too. You need to have the money, in order to win in that sense too. But as you already said, this is the messiness of bourgeois politics, of market democracy, in the real sense, market democracy.
Democracy for sale, by the seams of it.
Yes. You just sent me a Twitter.
This is a video that I've managed to find on Twitter of basically what I was saying with the police blocking voters. A small video that seems to show exactly that.
Okay, let's play that.
So the caption above this is the PRF, which I guess the police is making a blitz at the entrance of Kuwait today. Huge absurdity. It's already driving away the population of the countryside. Someone needs to do something. The people can't vote.
I see. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Right. I mean, obviously the judge has already commented and said that they believe that something has gone. So
an investigation is being launched. But obviously, if our sort of speculation is correct, which I think it is, that this is targeted at suspected Lula areas, the margins of popularity are likely much higher than the official polls show. Obviously, that popularity means nothing when it comes to who holds the reins of force in a country. The military can still overturn this if they wish. It will be interesting to see what happens in the weeks and months inside Brazil and surrounding its neighbors.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Obviously, Lula in the past was had strong ties with Hugo Chavez, and obviously that will have inherited now to Maduro. Same with Bolivia. He's got friends around him. I'd love to see this coalition come tighter, and I hope it does. They've got I can't remember the conference name of it, but the leftist conference of Latin countries. So I'm hoping to see sort of a return.
Yes.
With a vengeance of the policies that we read about. Obviously, I was quite young at the time, so I don't really remember firsthand him in the media at all.
I've got the example of the flagship policy, which he set up and is most famous for. Why is he loved? So obviously we've talked about corruption, we've talked about that he's won, we've talked about BRICS, we've talked about all this kind of stuff. Importantly, why? So why was he so popular? So yeah, the flagship policy, and also I had to check up on this. I remember some vague stuff about him being a sort of helping the poor, but I mean, what did that mean? How did he help the poor? So if you look here, this is from Brown University, so not exactly a left-wing source. Talks about his policies, but and his sort of leadership. The most important thing was this thing called Bolsa Familia, which was a family stipend. It was created in 2003, and essentially those in absolute poverty, so families with an income of less than 75 reais or less than 75 reais, or about $35 a month, were entitled to this. And basically what it meant was that they would get this money as long as, so if they had kids, so the program grants a sum of money per child, up to 3 children, so $70 a month, as long as they are vaccinated, stay in school, and do not engage in illegal child labor. So if you think about that, it's a very clever policy because it was aimed at obviously growing the human capital. So the problem with poverty is usually that people don't have opportunities. And why don't they have opportunities? Because they haven't had the right education. So it tries to give money for the immediate poverty of the day, which these families obviously were going through. And then it tries to deal with the poverty of the future. So keeping them in school and keeping them vaccinated too. So, reducing the cost on the state too. Later when they get sick, you are vaccinated, which is much cheaper than dealing with the full form of any illness. So yeah, and then of course the illegal child labor, the money obviously then is to stop them taking the money and also just going to work and pretending to go to school or something like that. Because obviously child labor would give them money too. But yeah, so you can see the sort of 3-pronged sort of approach there. Very clever, actually.
Yeah.
And it was
rewarding behavior that you want, and paying
Pardon?
people to stay away from behavior that you're trying to avoid.
Yeah. This is what he's, and this also formed part of Form Zero Hunger, sort of the bigger campaign. But obviously, there would have been many policies. I mean, if you have any government that's doing welfare, there's usually an array of different things with different metrics and whatnot. But I think this is the big. This is the big one. This was the flagship, the most famous policy from Lula, which affected and helped a lot of people, millions of people. So as of 2010, 12.4 million households were in the program. 1/6 of Brazil's strides in poverty reduction can be attributed to this program. So yeah, 1/6 of all poverty reduction was from just that program alone. And it costs only 0.5% of GDP, which you consider like defense spending. You know, if you're in NATO, that's 2%. And here, if you take 0.5% of the GDP, you dealt with 1/6 of poverty reduction, which is a pretty. I mean, that's what a government should be doing, right?
It's exactly.
Yeah.
It's interesting with him going after vaccinations as well. It just makes you think what COVID in Brazil would have been like under him to the Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro was a denier for a very long time of COVID until the point where he got it.
Yeah, right. Yes. So, I mean, obviously, coming back to Bolsonaro, that was a disaster. I mean, Brazil actually had one of the worst death rates per capita. Because Bolsonaro was one of these characters that didn't believe in masks and very macho, sort of kind of thing. It wasn't real.
Trumpian in that respect.
That was very Trump-like. Yes, that part was extremely Trump-like. Yeah. Just want a quick one before we move on from this part here. Just also, he did increase the minimum wage. So the other prominent thing he did was increasing the minimum wage from 200 real to 500 real, which is in US dollars, $100 to $205. And according to Brown University, this created 13 million new jobs. So there's always that debate, people say like, oh, well, if you increase the minimum wage, you're just going to increase the prices and that's it. That's all it does. It just creates inflation. But no, as Brown University says here, that's 13 million jobs and shows you, the value of redistributing income. If you put more money in the hands of poor people, they are consumers. They buy stuff and therefore there's, more cafes, more restaurants, more clothes to be purchased, whatever it is that they need. Those come up with that increase in minimum wage. So nice bit of economics there. So that's why Lula was so popular, for those policies, minimum wage and the stipend for going to school and being vaccinated. But I don't know, Chris. So we've covered quite a lot. I don't know if what else you would like to cover on this.
I think we have sort of done a fair bit, haven't we? Like, obviously, any subject that we bite, we always seem to bite off more than we can chew.
Yes.
Anything could be stretched out to a series because you can. Well, I think what we really set out to do here was to sort of give people sort of a refresher who these characters are, and really why this is significant. Obviously, we didn't see with the Peruvian election or the Bolivian election, that wasn't on the BBC. I don't think that would have been very highlighted on CNN in the States. But this election has been. As we said earlier on, even the fact that Barack Obama at one point called this man the most popular politician in the world, I can imagine a lot of people have. Like, I've seen everybody on the left, from the Marxist left to the wishy-washy Owen Jones centre left, congratulating the win. So I think it is significant, and it's going to stick into people's sort of imaginations quite significantly, I think. And I think a lot of people are quite optimistic and interested to see what's going to go on in the future. I think this guy is a social democrat. He's not a Marxist-Leninist, but he was a union worker. He increased the minimum wage. He engaged with China, BRICS, as well as the Belt and Road Initiative. Is very popular, as you said, globally, as well as with his people. I'm hopeful to see what will happen if... Oh, that was one thing that I think we should definitely mention that I've completely neglected. Talking about what is going to happen in the future, which you were just mentioning there, is that there is this currency that Noam Chomsky and Vijay Prashad mentioned, that a new currency that might be pushed in South America. And previously Venezuela had given a go at this, but obviously Venezuela is not as big economically and politically in the region, and of course is hamstrung by the US.
However, if Lula gets behind it with that economy, you might see the emergence of this currency. And it's called the SUR. So, they discussed this, Prashad and Chomsky, on Democracy Now!, called the SUR, which that would be very interesting to sort of, again, break the hegemony of the dollar as well as the IMF and the World Bank and whatnot. That would certainly have that power if it was introduced, if Lula did push that. Obviously, it's too early to say whether he'll even do that. And there's lots of things to consider with that. The jump to conclusion is, it's going to be like the euro. Well, I just hope that it's like the euro, but nothing like the euro.
The euro, we very much is dependent on the American dollar behind it. Where it comes to independent countries doing this in their own oppressed continent, it's usually a surefire way to get your house bombed. If you look at Gaddafi, who famously proposed a similar idea for all Africa currency. Any sort of egregious threat to American hegemony like that is bound to get a response. And hopefully Lula's thinking, this is my second round. I can be more radical than last time. I'm older. I'm going to make sure my best years aren't behind me, that this is the term that people remember. The world is in a very different state than it was in 2016. Obviously, 2006, sorry. We had, when we were living through the war on terror, that felt like the event. But now we've gone past that. We've gone through about 3 or 4 different once-in-a-lifetime crises since then, and it now feels like the war on terror was a treasured childhood memory at this point.
Yes, those were peaceful times.
Children dancing in the street, laughing. It was lovely.
It was a lovely time. A lovely time. Yeah, but the final point I want to make on this is that so Vijay Prashad said that Lula did campaign this time to the left of Lula himself. So Lula as previous president, he was campaigning to the left of that. So we are hopefully going to see a more left-wing Lula who will perhaps be more ambitious. He has said very positive things, that he doesn't want to do the corruption. He wants to sort of purge this corruption stuff from the party and be quite firm about that. We'll hopefully see what else he has in store. And I hope that along with all the other sort of left-leaning governments in South America, that they can come up with some sort of, ambitious program, and link it up with what's going on in the world, and we can see some advancements there. That would be great. I would love to see that. Poverty reduction and trade and whatnot. Let's we'll leave it there. And next week, I have no idea what our topic will be, so we will update you. Well, I guess it'll be a surprise. So we'll see you then. Thank you very much, Chris.
Right, see you next week.
Thank you very much.